What's going on, guys? Today we're going to be diving into some of the best weapon setups for just about any situation you're going to find yourself in New World. We're talking about PvE, PvP, leveling, dungeons, portals, you name it, we're going to talk about it. So as with anything in beta, what we talk about here might change between now and launch. And if it does, I'll make sure to update a video, get one out to you guys with all the new information. But for right now, let's talk about what we know, and we're going to start things off with the best leveling weapons. So the best leveling weapons, in my opinion, are the hatchet or rapier combined with the life staff or gauntlet. So why? Well, first off, the hatchet and or rapier gives some really solid single target damage and increases your movement speed to make getting around a little bit quicker. You have things like Berserker for hatchet, and after you spec into another minor note, it gives you a 20% movement speed increase for about 15 seconds. In terms of the rapier, you actually have a evade ability. There's a nice little animation canceling kind of method you can do to get around a little bit quicker as well. And the cool thing here is with the hatchet, you also have some great flexibility with throwing attacks and damage increases. The rapier focuses on good damage and bleeds. Now, the only thing to be aware of here is you're going to be dealing slightly lower damage early on because the undead have a resistance to slash and thrust damage. Now, it's nothing crazy. It's not like you're going to have a huge kind of issue with, dealing DPS or anything like that, but it's just something to be aware of. Now, on the other side, with our combos, right, we have Life Staff and Gauntlet. Now, Life Staff is a great choice for keeping yourself alive and buffed up, especially if you end up pulling large groups of enemies, which will happen all of the time because New World has some really insane aggro ranges. Now, the Life Staff has some really cool skills like Orb of Protection and Beacon. You can drop AoE heals on yourself and buff yourself up with things like Fortify, which is going to reduce all of your damage taken for a certain amount of time. Then you have the Ice Gauntlet. Now, the Ice Gauntlet is a good alternative because of its ability to drop a pylon to help dish out some extra damage and also pull threat on enemies. So if you're getting swarmed, you can drop a pylon, it'll pull a couple enemies off and kind of take a little bit of heat off you, and maybe you can get yourself healed back up. Now, the Gauntlet also has a ton of built-in crowd control. This is going to help slow down enemies, allow you to deal extra damage, or like I said earlier, if you need to make a getaway, drop a pylon, slow things down a bit, and then escape. So magic weapons are a great alternative because you don't need any ammunition to use them, unlike the bow and the musket. Early on, making flint arrows is pretty simple, but making bullets for the musket is not. So going with a magic weapon might be the best bet until you can either reliably find ammunition or make ammunition. Now, if you want to swap out the hatchet or the rapier for something a bit more tanky like the great axe, then you can absolutely do that. Feel free. Just know you're going to lose a little bit of movement ability, but gain things like self-healing and crowd control. We'll be going into the great axe here in a moment. So those are the best leveling weapons in my opinion. Let's go ahead and change gears a little bit and let's move into the best group weapons, starting with PvE. So if you're going to be a part of a PvE group and clear things like portals, arenas, or dungeons, there are some really great combinations that you can put together to help clear out trash, increase damage towards bosses, and control situations a little bit better. So starting things off with your tank. So if you want a tank, the weapon choice for you is going to be pretty straightforward. You need a sword and a shield for actual tanking that's going to help boost survivability. And then I would recommend pairing this with a great axe or a warhammer for extra crowd control, self-healing, and some really cool abilities. So the great axe is a fantastic one to pair with a sword and shield because it's incredibly useful at controlling groups of enemies, and like I mentioned earlier, some amazing self-healing. There are some phenomenal skills called Reap, which pulls enemies towards you and heals you for the damage done, Maelstrom that will again pull enemies towards you, and an extremely useful skill called Gravity Well that you can throw and it pulls all the enemies together wherever that axe lands and deals damage. And if you spec into this, it'll also passively grant Fortify to your entire team, which reduces total damage taken and helps out the healer quite a bit. So this one is a fantastic weapon to pair, but it is not the only weapon. You also have the Warhammer. The Warhammer has some fantastic cleave, AoE, and crowd control skills all in its Crowd Crusher tree. And all of the skills for the Warhammer have some really great bonuses. You can apply Weaken to enemies, you can give out Fortify to allies, you can regain some health on hit, you can give yourself haste to increase your movement speed. So there's a lot of things you can do with the Warhammer. In my opinion, the Great Axe slightly edges it out, but this is still a fantastic alternative. So if you're a tank, those are the weapons I would take a look at, but let's go ahead and flip to the other side, and that's going to be healers. When it comes to healing in New World, your weapon is already accounted for, kind of like tanking. You need to have a life staff equipped in order to dish out some heals, in order to keep your group alive. So with the life staff, you can either go pure healing, or you can go into the protection tree, or you can weave the two together for kind of a hybrid setup. Make sure to grab this minor node called Absolved. It's going to cause all attacks to not use mana, which is great, and any light attacks that pass through enemies will also heal them a little bit. So fantastic minor node to pick up there. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but there's also tons of buffs you can hand out. Fortify buffs, AoE heals, protections, and other ways to help bring your party up and give them a huge advantage. And because there are some minor nodes that are going to increase healing as long as you have the life staff equipped, there isn't going to be a ton of opportunity to be swapping back and forth between weapons. So I would highly recommend keep the life staff in your hand, but if you do need to dish out some extra damage or help control the situation, I would highly recommend going with a bow or an ice gauntlet. The bow is going to give you some fantastic evades and AoE damage. The ice gauntlet is going to help with that pylon that you can easily cast and forget, or drop some slows and AoE damage down to help control the situation. So when it comes to healing, you're pretty much going to be using the life staff and just healing directly. There isn't a lot of kind of back and forth, especially in PvE. So now that we've talked about tanking and we've talked about healing, let's talk about DPS. So I want to start with the ranged category. So for ranged DPS, there are some solid options that New World has, and it's tricky because all of these weapons perform exceptionally well on their own. So you don't really have a meta established quite yet on which one is extremely better than the other. So what we're gonna do is go through the options, and then I'll give a few examples on how either I use them or I saw them being used by other players. I mean, you can go like full Daniel Boone and roll a musket with a hatchet. You can channel kind of your inner wizard Harry and go fire staff with ice gauntlet as your backup. So there's just a lot that you can do here, but let's go ahead and get things started with the bow and the musket. Now, all of these pair extremely well with just about anything since they can be self-sufficient on their own. Now, for the bow, we have some great ways to use this weapon. Now, our first option is the skirmisher tree, and this tree is more AoE focused, dive kind of gameplay focused, weaving in and out of combat, taking advantage of dodges to increase our overall damage output with evasive tactics, which causes your damage to increase by 20% after you dodge something. Now, the other more relevant way to play this in a group is with the hunter tree. This tree is going to give a variety of high damage skills and a bunch of minor nodes that are going to give you some extra damage. This tree also rewards skill by increasing your headshot damage. So if you're someone who is really good at sniping, things like that, then this is going to be the tree for you. Now, personally, I like to pair my bow with a hatchet or a gauntlet. That way I can either get in for some awesome single target damage, or I can drop ice pylons and slows to control the battlefield a little bit more and give myself some additional range damage. So let's go ahead and move into the other ammunition consuming range weapon, and that is the musket. So the musket comes in two flavors, one that rewards headshots and skilled shooting like we just talked about with the bow, and the other is all about traps and medium ranged gameplay. So for me, the traps one is way more interesting personally, and in my opinion, this one is way better to use in group settings in PvE. Now, for the PvP side of the fence, we'll talk about this in a minute, but I've seen some really badass players just run through people if they're good with the sharpshooter musket, because the sharpshooter tree gives a big stackable damage increase if you continue to land shots. You can apply some nasty burns with the powder burn skill. But I think the biggest takeaway from this tree is that if you can't find a spot to take a knee and fire some shots, then you will not be able to deal that much damage. And because dungeons are incredibly chaotic, you can't really take advantage of dropping to a knee and dealing consecutive shots unless you have a tank that really knows what they're doing and is able to control crowds pretty well. So that leaves us with the trapper tree. Now, this one is pretty much as it sounds. It revolves around setting up traps and then buffing the hell out of those traps. So at the the start, the trap is just going to root enemies, right? And then you can kind of lay into them, dealing extra damage. But after some investment, those traps will increase all damage done to the target. They'll heal you. You can drop multiple traps. You can throw sticky bombs to cause massive explosions, dealing AoE damage. You can overcharge your musket with your powerful shot. So there's a lot of different things you could do in the trapper tree that really makes much more sense when it comes to fighting against scripted enemies. PvP is a different story, but for now, that's the one I recommend. And you can pair this with a hatchet or a rapier to help stack up some of that single target damage. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and move into the magic side of the fence. We're going to talk about the fire staff, since we all know what the gauntlet is capable of already. So jumping right into the fire staff, this is a strong AoE and cleave weapon that applies deep burns onto enemies. However, some of these skills are channels and they do need to be maintained. So this is something to kind of keep in mind. And this is also why the fire staff is pretty viable in group settings versus solo settings or in PvP, because it's a lot easier to sit in back behind the tank, channel those abilities, and just drop bombs onto enemies, wiping out pretty much anything in front of you. Now, the fire staff also has a old skill that a lot of people really liked in the preview that we saw back in 2020, and that was the teleport skill that used to be on the life staff. So this is still somewhat available on the fire staff with a skill called burnout. You're going to dash and teleport forward, ignite enemies. But between the two trees for the fire staff, we have the fire mage, which is more PvE focused, and then the pyromancer, which is more of a PvP focused tree. So the fire mage tree has some heavy damage abilities. You have meteor shower, pillar of fire, fireball. The fireball skill is going to deal initial damage and then leave a big burning AoE to continue dishing out some damage. It's awesome for dungeons and portal content because you can group up enemies and just burn them down. Same thing with pillar of fire and meteor shower. You're going to be dealing a ton of damage stacking those things together. You can end up pairing this with a great axe, and then you have a fantastic cleave and AoE combo that's going to be good for just about any situation. So now let's go ahead and jump into the melee side of the house. So for melee weapons, we do have a decent variety to choose from. Now let's go into hatchet. So you can pair the hatchet with literally anything else. I do recommend the musket. The hatchet is split into two trees, the berserker tree and the throwing tree. So the berserker tree offers an incredible self buff called berserk, which increases all damage done by 20%. And if you continue to invest into this skill, it'll also heal you for all your damage done. It'll increase your movement speed. And there's just a lot that comes out of that skill. And this berserker tree also focuses heavily on all-out offense with heavy strikes, flurries of attacks, things like that. And if you reach the final node on the tree, you actually get a chance to avoid death, be left with 50 HP, and be immortal for a few seconds, which is great for just about any situation, whether you're in PvP, PvE, portals, out in the world, just running around, all of that. So let's go ahead and talk about the other tree really quick, and that's the throwing tree. So the throwing tree provides a solid range of skills. A lot of these seem pretty useful in PvP. You have things like infected throw, which applies disease, which reduces the target's healing and weakens them, which also reduces their damage done. Then you have evasion skills like social distancing, which allows you to deal damage and then leap backwards. So overall, the hatchet does pair well with most other weapons. I prefer to use it with a musket. I feel like this really kind of combos well together, and it's really ready for just about any situation. Then we have the rapier, and we can pair this with a fire staff or a musket. So the rapier does come in two flavors, blood or grace. Each tree has a very different approach on how this weapon is going to be used. The blood tree is pretty self-explanatory. It works around maximizing bleed damage and reducing your cooldowns. The grace tree gives lots and lots of mobility. You have skills like evade, which is basically another dodge. You have fleche, which is a spinning leap attack that's going to deal damage and lunge forward, kind of piercing through enemies. Now, this weapon is similar to the fire staff. The grace tree, in my opinion, is fantastic for PvP. Lots of mobility, ways to get around your opponent, while the blood tree is fantastic for PvE. And the rapier pairs well with the fire staff or the musket to help give some extra DPS and range. Then we have the Great Axe. So we talked about the Great Axe and all of the things that this thing can do in the tanking role, but I did want to call out a few DPS specific nodes that are fantastic for this weapon in a group setting. So first things first, you have the Revenge and Greed nodes. These are two separate nodes, and these are both going to increase your outgoing damage by 5%, stacking up to 3 times whenever you either block an attack or use a light attack. And the cool thing here is if you have full stacks on both of these nodes, you're looking at a 30% damage increase that has no cooldown. So you're either going to be fluctuating between 0 and 30% pretty much the entire time. Then you can combine that with the Mauler's Fury or the Bloodlust nodes at the end of each tree, pick one basically, and you can get a massive damage buff of up to 90% if everything lines up correctly if you decide to go with Mauler's Fury. Now, this is one of my favorite weapons, and I cannot wait to see what other people come up with when they're pairing this with other weapons. They're kind of figuring out different gem placements. So this weapon has a massive potential, and like I said, super excited to see what people come up with. I recommend pairing this with a Fire Staff or an Ice Gauntlet for extra control or extra damage. But let's go ahead and move into the next one, and that is the Warhammer. So like the Great Axe, we covered the Warhammer a little bit in the tanking section, so we know how well it can control the battlefield and crowds of enemies. But some of the other perks the Warhammer brings to the table are things like armor penetration and flattening of enemies, allowing your team to get some more damage in. So let's go ahead and move into the spear. So when it comes to weapon versatility, it's really hard to argue against the spear. I mean, you can throw it, you can cleave with it, you can impale with it. This thing is the jack of all trades, and while its damage might not be huge compared to the rapier or the hatchet, it makes up by giving you more ways to deal that damage. Now, the trees for the spear are the zoner and the impaler. The zoner tree allows you to throw the spear, whirlwind, sweep the legs out from under enemies, and all of these skills give some great control and help create distance between you and whatever your target is, which is where the spear excels, at that kind of like medium range damage, keeping things at a distance. Now, the impaler tree is all about bleeds, rends, and stuns. Plus, if you unlock the last node, the spear is going to deal up to 30% more damage for each debuff on the target, which is huge and very, very easily obtainable. And this pairs really well with other weapons like the musket or the rapier, which can easily apply debuffs and keep those debuffs up. So those are all of the different weapons and their PvE uses. So you're out there, you're running dungeons, you're closing portals, you're just leveling, you're exploring the world, anything not against other players. These are some really cool ways to use these and some really cool pairings. But now I want to talk about PvP. And when it comes to PvP, this is where a lot of the action in New World happens. And because of that, you need to have a strong weapon combo to make sure you take care of business if you do run across other players who want to square up. Now, these weapons are all top tier right now, and they're versatile enough to get you out of most encounters alive, but please keep in mind, these will most likely be tuned a bit once the game goes live, so they might perform a little bit differently, but like I said, I'll update you guys. Let's go ahead and let's get into it. Now, the first big combo I want to talk about is the spear and the musket, and this is a very strong pairing. The idea here is that the spear has strong enough control and range versatility that it makes for a great medium range weapon that can apply bleeds, swipe the legs out from under enemies, stun, rend, which increases your damage done, and the musket has the best range of any weapon, and it comes with some amazing crowd control skills in the trapper tree, along with some fantastic high-powered abilities that apply burns in the sharpshooter tree. So between these two, you're looking at a really, really versatile combination. Then we also have the rapier and the fire staff. So if you like going fast, then this combination is just perfect for you. I mean, both of these weapons offer some great movement abilities. You have the rapier's evade and fleche, plus the burnout skill from the fire staff. And with the current kind of PvP meta sort of focusing on lightweight armor, which is going to give you the dodge roll and not the sidestep, it's important to be able to move quickly to avoid things, but also to catch opponents if they try to run away or flank them. And both of these weapons excel in both leaving ailments on enemies with your burns and bleeds. So with this combo, I mean, you pair up the speed, the flanking ability, and the high damage with those lingering debuffs, and you're going to be set up pretty well for any PvP encounter. Then we have the rapier and the gauntlet. So the rapier and the gauntlet function similar to the fire staff pairing, except here you're swapping a movement skill and burns for slows and extra control. Again, amazing setup. So if you're someone who likes to control enemies a little bit more and values slows over burns, go ahead and go with this combo. And then next we have the Fire Staff and the Gauntlet. So if you just want to go full wizard and you want to both control the battlefield and deliver scorched earth, then you need to sync up both these weapons. The Gauntlet is going to give you some extreme control, slows, allow you to get some extra DPS with the Ice Pylon. You can entomb yourself with the Ice Tomb ability to get a big kind of mana regeneration. And then the Fire Staff is going to let you drop some big AoE and single target spells on the enemies who are slowed. So between the two of these, they operate pretty well. Last up, we have a crowd favorite, and that is the Great Axe and the Hatchet. So right now, the Great Axe is a bit overtuned. It can sometimes deliver double heavy strikes when it's not supposed to, and this has pushed this weapon into an S tier category when it's most likely going to be A tier at launch. But with that being said, it is an extremely diverse weapon, and it really cannot be understated. You have Gravity Well that's going to pull in all the enemies and deal damage, which is great for grouping things up. You have Maelstrom, which again pulls enemies towards you. And then lastly, you have Reap, a skill that again pulls enemies towards you and then also heals you for the damage done. And to cap all this off, the Great Axe has a ton of minor nodes that increase your damage if you block, if you use a light attack, if you have an attack blocked by an enemy. So it's a pretty insane weapon right now that just seems perfect for just about anything and everything. And that's why it pairs so well with the Hatchet. So the Hatchet has been a crowd favorite since the preview in 2020. This weapon attacks fast, deals great damage, gives a self-buff called Berserker extremely early. It's going to increase all of your outgoing damage, your movement speed. It's going to heal you for the damage done. And honestly, between these two weapons, you're going to be dealing tons of damage, healing yourself constantly, and then be able to close gaps on opponents with the Great Axe's abilities to either pull enemies towards you or kind of pull them towards wherever your axe lands. So there's just so much utility built into this pairing that honestly, this is probably what I'm gonna be going with right out of the gate. So that is it for the New World PvP pairings. And if you guys want to see more New World PvP and have a great breakdown of kind of all of the PvP tricks like the animation canceling, weapon tier lists, all that kind of stuff, be sure to check out my friend Rogue Scythe. I put his link in the description below. Guy does an awesome job of getting all this together, helping me out, answering a ton of questions that I have. So cannot thank Rogue Scythe enough. So like I said, link in the description below. Go check them out and give them some support because fantastic stuff. So guys, those are the best weapon combos for getting things done in New World, in my opinion. Right now, it's pretty close in terms of balance, and while there are some instances where a weapon might edge out another one, it's still very early to call an absolute meta. So hopefully this will give everyone something new to try, give you an idea of what you might want to roll when the game actually launches. And as always, if you guys want more New World content, please subscribe, stick around, and be creating lots of different guides and videos to cover, well, just about everything. So again, thank you guys so much for all the support. This has been Vulkan, and I'll talk to you on the next one.